Okay, greetings to everyone. Thank you to the JLE for this opportunity to add to our online programming in this difficult time. Thank you to Gemma, who is making this whole technicalities of this webinar possible. Thank you to all of you who are joining us, doctors and healthcare workers and everyone else as well. Please just give me a quick greeting in my chat box so that I know you can see and hear me. Alan in Telstar, nice to have you with us. Howard, great. Canada. Gibraltar, nice to have you with us. Claire, thank you. Benny, thank you for joining us. Elias, Eitan, okay, going too fast for me to answer. Coco, or Manhattan, nice to have you with us. Great, okay. So I see people clocking in from all over the world. Okay, good. Esther, nice to have you with us as well. Manchester, Ovadia, Johannesburg. Diane, great to have you with us as well. Okay, seeing a lot of old friends as well. Okay, thanks for joining. Let's try to make our way through this difficult and very relevant subject, which is the subject of risk to doctors, healthcare workers, risk to life, and limb. How do we approach this on a from a halachic perspective? First of all, I'd like to dedicate this shir to all the people who are ill. Secondly, to all the healthcare workers, Jewish and non-Jewish, who are fighting on the front lines. And also to make this in memory of my late father-in-law, whose yortzeit is actually tonight. It's Yosef ben Yaakov Michael, was a remarkable individual. And one of his characteristics was teaching us how to think logically, even in difficult or emergency situations. He was an engineer and approached things logically, a very good faculty for doctors and healthcare workers to cultivate. The subject of risk and danger to people in the course of trying to save lives. How do we approach that subject? I'm going to do it like this with your permission. First of all, I'll start with the bottom line. I don't want people itching and scratching and complaining that it's too academic and not relevant. So I'm going to start with the bottom line and then backtrack and try to give you the sources for this critical area. And I hope as we go through the sources you'll feel some of the nuances of the subject. And I dare say, I would like to venture the hope that you'll enjoy the Torah of this subject, fraught as it is with tension and life and death matters. So the bottom line is, if you're a doctor, you may indeed expose yourself to risk in the course of treating people, to help them in any medical situation that they need, and certainly in the attempt to save life. Not only that, as a doctor, you are required to risk your life. Sylvie, we indeed will do the shir for Zahara Penina Bat Esther and Meir Ben Sarah. We already said that we're doing it for everyone as well. I'm sure there are many other names as well. So bottom line is, as a healthcare worker or a doctor, you are required, not only as a healthcare worker, by the way, as any Jew, you're required to put your life on the line to save others to a certain degree, and we'll try to explain what that degree is. But if you're a professional, you've taken on professional risk, you're obliged to expose yourself to some degree of risk, some circumstances more, some circumstances less, and I'll try to clarify that. And therefore those people who are exposing themselves now in the course of their work, both in their private practices or because they've been obliged to do so by their health systems, the general approach we take in circumstances like this is that is generally required and certainly allowed, and we'll try to explain where the limits of that are. The practical question obviously doesn't need to be spoken out here. We are now facing an epidemic which we haven't experienced anything like this for the last 100 years. Not since the influenza epidemic of 1918 have we been put in a situation like this. I won't depress you with the figures of that epidemic, but mankind has known on previous occasions this sort of epidemic. In 1918, the case fatality rate or the mortality rate probably ended up at about 2%, but that cost the lives of millions of people. As you know, at the lowest estimate, about 50 million people died, 2 million Americans, was a total pandemic. And for unknown reasons, it targeted not only the elderly and the infirm. There was a cadre of people 20 to 40 years old who, for unknown reasons, were affected as well and died. It had some unusual features. It began in July and spread to October, November, and then trailed on after that. That's summer months, which is unusual for influenza. And by the way, one of the messages we're getting in this particular epidemic is that we have a lot of unknowns. I had the privilege of speaking to Professor Barry Shub a few times during this epidemic. One of the most concerning aspects of this is that we actually are lacking a lot of relevant information. Probably the one on the forefront of everyone's mind right now is whether robust immunity will be developed. That is a particular aspect of danger that we are all concerned about. The problem being that if immunity is developed, and going forward after you've had COVID infection, you develop an immunity, then of course as we build numbers of people who have recovered, we will build a herd immunity in the community, and we will be gradually protected. Not only that, we can start using people who are survivors to go out and provide essential services. Doctors who've been at home and recovered will go out and be able to treat people with much less fear, or zero fear of infection, and of course we can transform our society over the coming weeks to months if that materializes. However, it's not clear whether the response will be a robust immunity. There are two main reasons for that, of course. The first is that we actually don't know how immunogenic this actual virus will be. So that's one reason for anxiety. There's one report so far of a person who was reinfected. One German patient who recovered has apparently documented to become reinfected a week later. I have my doubts about that. And of course one anecdotal report will not serve to establish that as fact. But that's one reason for very serious concern. And another reason for concern is the virus's potential to mutate. If it is a stable variant, then of course immunity will be, and immunity is generated, then immunity will be lasting. But if the virus mutates as seasonal flu does, then of course we are looking at something much more serious. If in fact we will not develop lasting immunity for one or both of these reasons, that has the potential to translate this very bad dream into a screaming nightmare. So this faces us, and of course Hashem is intending that, right? Whatever God does is intended, and that particular aspect of vulnerability we need to bear in mind. Let's begin this class with just one. Spiritual concept, if you like, before we get to the halachic, and that is we are being challenged here by a very small organism. Rav Asher Weiss this week made the point that just like Titus was challenged when he issued a battle cry, a challenge to God to do battle with him. God said, I will battle you, but I won't use my mighty armies. I'll use the smallest creature in my world, my mosquito. And I think, why a mosquito? We'll perhaps at some other time discuss. But here we are being challenged as well, brought to our knees on an international level by the smallest of creatures. The virus is so small and so rudimentary, in fact, viruses in general, that, as you probably know, there's an academic debate whether they're considered alive or not. Don't have their own metabolism. As you know, the virus is using the cell's metabolism, and therefore there's a fascinating philosophical debate about whether viruses even deserve to be called alive. Be that as it may, they are bringing us to our knees, and they are so small, of course, you can't even see them under light microscope. The virus is measured in a few nanometers, right? And that is, as a bacterium, as you know, measures about a micron across. Viruses get up to about 500 nanometers, 500, which is, half of hundreds or even thousands of viruses can fit onto one bacterial cell. A red blood cell is about 7 microns across. Just to give you some idea, we're talking about much, much smaller than that. So let me go through some of the halachic parameters here which define the Jewish attitude to healthcare workers undertaking risk in the course of their work. I'm seeing a few questions on my screen. Let me ask you, please, to hold the questions for a moment. Let me develop the overall approach to this subject, and then I'll be very happy to stop for questions. If I'm able, I'll be more than happy to answer. So here we have an interesting discussion, a debate, as it were, between the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. So let me explain this debate. Our discussion begins with the Beis Yosef, the Bet Yosef. And the Bet Yosef in Chosh and Mishpat is talking about the question of whether one must risk one's life to save another. If you like to look it up, it's in Taf Chaf Vav, which is 426. There the Bet Yosef quotes Yerushalmi. So he says that the Jerusalem Talmud tells us that a person is obliged to enter serious risk to one's life in order to save someone else who's in greater risk. Now, he doesn't quote which Rishalmi he means. This will be a little opportunity for us to do some detective work and try to figure out which portion, which section in the Jerusalem Talmud is he referring to when he says that the Jerusalem Talmud requires one to risk one's life. But that's what he says, and he quotes the Yerushalmi. Now, he doesn't go into detail there about the percentage of risk, the proportion of risk to the rescuer, how risky it has to be to the victim, but it seems like a victim whose life is in serious danger. In other words, let's say someone will certainly die without any rescue attempt, and a rescuer will now go into that situation to try to rescue the victim. The risk to the rescuer will be less than the risk to the victim, but it will be very material and significant. How much risk? Not clear. We'll have to characterize that later. Are we talking about a greater than 50% risk, but less than the 100% that the victim is exposed to? Are we talking about less than 50%? This will all be part of our discussion. But the simple fact is that the Bet Yosef says that the Jerusalem Talmud tells us that one is obliged, to risk one's life to save someone else. We're not talking specifically about doctors. This could be a regular citizen jumping into a raging ocean to save someone who's drowning, or a fireman going to a house to save a person from a burning building, or a layman, a non-professional. This is a general concept that is brought as an obligation. Now, fascinatingly, the Bet Yosef does not codify this in his Code of Jewish Law. As you know, Rabbi Yosef Karo, living in Sfat in the 1570s, when he came to codify his work, the Bet Yosef, in the form that we have it, which is known as the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, this law is absent. Very interesting. So he goes into discussion of the law in his, let's call it more academic work, or his in the background work, which is a more full. But when he comes to codify the law in practice, he does not mention this law at all. Now we have a very interesting discussion about a law that is not brought in the Bet Yosef, not brought in the Shulchan Aruch. Why does he mention the law in the discussion in the Bet Yosef, but he doesn't codify it in the definitive code of practice, which is the Code of Jewish Law? It seems that there are three possible reasons for why the Bet Yosef would not bring a law in the Code of Jewish Law. The first possibility is because it's a law that's only to be applied on rare occasions. He's trying to make the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, very concise, to the point, and of major practical relevance. And so when something is of rare application, he might well leave it out. Well, in this case, that does not seem to be the case. This is a very relevant law, and throughout Jewish history, of course, it's had great practical application, and it's a life and death question of constant application, so we cannot suggest that the reason that he left it out is because it's not relevant. The second reason why the Beis Yosef would leave out a law when he codifies the Code of Jewish Law is because there's another place where you can infer the same law. That's the second reason. So he'll not codify a law if, in fact, there's another place where you can find that law. We have examples of this. There are one or two things the Rambam does not mention, which can be inferred from some other place. Whereas Shevet HaLevi, which goes into this, in fact, on life-saving question, Rav Moshe Feinstein, whom he quotes, actually has a brilliant solution to one or two of these challenges. But if you can infer the law from another place, then he will not find it necessary to make the law explicit in a second place. This does not seem to be the case. There's no known place in the Code of Jewish Law in which we can infer the law that one needs to expose one's life to risk in order to save someone else. And that leaves us with the third option. The third reason that the Beis Yosef does not codify a law which he discusses elsewhere in the Code of Jewish Law is because he holds that the law does not apply. He doesn't hold of it, as we say. In other words, this Yerushalmi, this Jerusalem Talmud that he's talking about is something that is indeed discussed in the Jerusalem Talmud, but it must be that he feels that it's not halachically applicable. And the obvious reason is because he must hold that the Babylonian Talmud disagrees. Right? The Babylonian Talmud disagrees. Now, you know, when there's a debate between Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, we follow the Babylonian. So if the Jerusalem Talmud, let's spell it out clearly, if there's some place in the Talmud Yerushalmi that says that you're required to expose your life to a serious risk in the attempt to save someone else, and the Babylonian Talmud disagrees, or in fact does not mention it, if there's no source in the Talmud Bavli for this, we would rule according to the Talmud Bavli, which is that there's no such law, or more properly, that indeed it would be forbidden. That will be the inference, right? If you hold that it's an obligation to save a life, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, if the Bavli disagrees with that, the natural inference, or where we will see there may be room for debate here, the natural inference will be that in fact it will be forbidden to risk your life to save someone else. And in fact, that is the approach that most of the commentators take. They deduce from the fact that the Shulchan Aruch, it does not code this law, that in fact it is forbidden. So let me summarize the discussion at this point. There's a suggestion based on a Yerushalmi that one is required to risk one's life to save someone else, and in fact the Code of Jewish law is not codified, based on the understanding that the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, would not allow this. Bottom line at this point would be, in definitive Jewish law, one may not risk one's life to save someone else. Now, before we get carried away, we'll have to go into the details and the percentages and a full qualification of this. But at this point, that is what we would say. Let's take a moment to see if we can identify the Yerushalmi. Well, all the commentaries who talk about this since the time of the Code of Jewish Law have pointed us in a direction. Rav Asher Weiss gave a shir about this recently. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to download it to you. It was a shir that he gave in Detroit about risk to life. And of course, he's been asked this question all the time now. And these questions are coming through thick and fast. Right? Nothing could be more relevant. I've been approached recently by a number of pregnant doctors or healthcare workers or midwives concerned about risk to their pregnancies when they're going into care for other people. Of course, a midwife is involved in a life and death questions. I'm aware of physicians in the United States who've been drafted into broad testing of their patients. And of course, these are the questions that are coming up all the time. Not simply the question of sticking to your guns and being at your post, but elderly doctors who have risk factors themselves. I've been approached by a number of healthcare workers who are not in frontline life-saving roles, who are also being asked to continue in their roles. These are very, very relevant questions happening all the time. So, which is the Yerushalmi? Well, in the Talmud tractate called Trumas, in the 8th parak, at the very end, the last Mishnah in Trumas, the Yerushalmi has a series of fascinating events that transpired during the Amoraic period. And here's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that Rav Amy, according to one opinion Rav Issi, was captured. Right? This was during the lifetime of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So during in that phase of history, living in Israel as they were, he was captured by a group of bandits or terrorists, right, in a place called Sachsucha. I have no idea where that is, but in that place he was captured. The Gemara doesn't go into the practical details, but the Mefarshim say this was some group of robbers or thieves or bandits, and his life was very clearly in danger. When he was captured, Rabbi Yonasan, who was present at the time, said, "Let him wrap himself in his shroud," or let the victim wrap himself in his shroud. This is a statement of great hopelessness. Why he made that comment needs discussion. There are one or two interpretations. They're going beyond the simple announcing of a fact that his situation was hopeless. But that is what Rabbi Yonasan said. Reish Lakish was present at the time. Now Reish Lakish, as you know, was the chavrusa of Rabbi Yochanan. And Reish Lakish, not only was he one of the preeminent Amoraic sages of the time, his personal history was that he started out as a fighter himself. Right? Reish Lakish, before he became a Baal Tshuva, right, before he was turned on to learning Torah, was a head of a group of fighters or bandits, and he himself was not afraid of battle, and he was no stranger to battle. Reish Lakish said, "I will go and make an attempt to save Rav Amy. I'll either kill or be killed." Right, that's what he said. And Reish Lakish duly went into the stronghold or the lair or the den or whatever the place was where these people were holding Rav Amy, and as it happened, negotiated with them, was not required to do battle, and he brought him home safe and sound. This, no doubt, is the section in the Yerushalmi that is being referred to, and we learn from this, according to the Beis Yosef, that this is a precedent teaching us that one is required to go into danger to save someone else. Now, what degree of danger? Well, we know that Rav Ami was in serious danger of his life, so much so that the great Rabbi Yonasan said, we might as well wrap him in his shrouds. So that we know was what we call virtually a certain death. For Reish Lakish, single-handedly, to wade into a gang of murderous, lethal bandits must have been a danger of a very high order. It is true that he survived. Not only survived, but brought home Rav Ami. And no doubt Reish Lakish was a scary figure, right? And I'm sure those bandits made a very wise decision in not standing up to him in battle. Nevertheless, we assume that it was a major risk to his own life. And this is the precedent for learning that, at least according to the Yerushalmi, one is required to risk one's life. Now, obviously, a little thought will show you that there's no proof from this Yerushalmi, because you might as well say that all it teaches us is that this is permissible. And indeed, there are authorities who learn it that way. Again, he went in and risked his life to save another Jew. All that teaches you is that it's allowed. If it was prohibited, he would not have done it. So we can learn at least that it was allowed. However, the Beis Yosef is very clear that he uses this as a precedent to teach us not only that it's allowed, but that it's proper and indeed an obligation. That is the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi goes on with some other fascinating realia there about people in danger and how that was handled. That is the chapter ends with a number of fascinating incidents, which perhaps this is not perhaps the time to go into. So that is the source in Yerushalmi, and as I say, it is not brought in. It's not brought definitively. You will not find in the Code of Jewish Law. Not only that, but the Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh, and the Tur also do not bring it. Right? So it's not codified in normative law for us, and therefore our basic ruling is that to expose oneself to a very high order of risk in the attempt to save another life, one should not do. That's the basic approach to this question. Now, the question that raises is, well, if it's not an obligation to risk one's life in that fashion, can we learn that possibly it's allowed? After all, the Code of Jewish Law is telling us that it's not an obligation, but could we perhaps learn from the Yerushalmi that it's permitted, right? The Code of Jewish Law is not obligating us to do it, but perhaps we could learn that it's allowed. And in fact, there are authorities that learn, indeed, that is true. The Netziv, for example, in Kuf Chaf Tes, the Netziv learns that, in fact, one may expose oneself to a very high risk. Again, we'll have to try to quantify these things, but one may expose oneself to a very high order of risk in order to do this. Tiferes Israel, in the 8th chapter of Yoma, says the same thing. By the way, there are commentaries that say that putting yourself at high risk to save someone else means high risk but less than 50%. You see, there's a concept here that if you put yourself to a risk that is more than 50%, that might be tantamount to giving your life away. Right? Less than 50%, 40%, 45%, very high risk. But if it's more than 50%, it's possible that even Yerushalmi would not allow that. Now, we don't know what the percentage of risk was that Reish Lakish went into. That's not clear. And there is a debate about this point. We'll see that there are one or two authorities who go even further and say, even if it's more than 50%, even if it's virtually certain that you'll die, you may in fact give away your life to save someone else. That's not the normative position in halacha, but again, we'll see that there are outliers in halakhic literature that say that. So, that is the background to our discussion. Now, the next step in Jewish history that we need to or the next source that we need to examine, which is probably the most famous in this area, is the Radbuzz. Now, the Radbuzz says as follows. There are two tshuvas in the Radbuzz, and they are very famous because the dramatic nature of the question, and because this particular source in the Radbuzz has major application in terms of people risking their lives, for example, when giving a live kidney donation. Right, and I'm sure you know this is a question that comes up all the time. We're not only talking about healthcare workers. You probably know that Orthodox Jews have a low rate of post-mortem kidney donations, right, for many reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But we have an unbelievably high rate of live kidney donations. Right, as Rav Asher Weiss himself says, getting quite emotional, he's very proud of the fact that Orthodox Jews have a very high rate of people coming forward to give their kidneys. And I'm talking about what we call altruistic donation, not a kidney directed to a particular recipient like someone in your family. In fact, I had a young lady recently, mother of a number of children, begging me to be allowed to give a kidney to some unspecified, unknown recipient, right? That was not so easy I'm not sure her husband was so keen on that, and so many young children who need her. Be that as it may, when a donor considers giving a kidney, you're talking about a risk to life. Now, the risk to life of a kidney donor is very, very small, but it is certainly something that is real. So the Radbuzz has been used as a source for many of these issues. Let me tell you of the most fascinating tshuva in the Radbuzz, Rav David ben Zimri. We're talking about the great Sephardic halachic authority. He lived in Egypt. We're going back 600 years. The Radbuzz was faced with the following incredible dilemma. Incredible dilemma. If you'd like to look this up, it is in Taf Resh Chav Vav and Taf Resh Chav Zayin. That's 626 and 627 in the third section of the Radbuzz. It's worth working through this because it's particularly fascinating, amazing question, and very, very fascinating answer that he gives. The question he was asked was, let me give you he doesn't bring the details of the historical background, but I heard this from Rav Zilberstein, so let me give you the historical background and the question that he was faced with. There was a Jew in Turkey who was accused of stealing. Now, I don't need to tell you that the Muslim punishment for stealing is having one's hand amputated, right? Cut off the hand of the thief. This, of course, is completely unacceptable in Jewish law, completely inappropriate. But nevertheless, that is the Muslim punishment for theft. This Jew managed to escape. By the way, it's not recorded at all whether he was guilty of theft or simply accused. We have no idea about the actual facts on the ground. But he was accused and sentenced to have his hand cut off. This Jew managed to escape, and he fled to Egypt. The Sultan in Turkey captured another Jew, put him in jail, and sent an ultimatum to the Jew in Egypt as follows. If you refuse to come home, I will kill this man. If you come home, I will release him and cut your hand off. Let's get this clear. There's a Jew in Egypt who is safe. In the region, the locale of the Radbuzz. He gets a message that there's another poor, innocent Jew being captured in Turkey, threatened with death, as a method of pressurizing him to come home. And his ultimatum is, you either stay where you are, this Jew dies, you come home, I'll release the Jew and cut your hand off. In other words, the question is he obliged to go home and lose his hand to save the life of another Jew? Now, we're not talking at this point about putting yourself in danger. We're talking about losing a limb. Okay? Parallel, perhaps, to giving a kidney. But the point is, that was the nature of the question. And he went to the Radbuzz and he said, Rabbi, am I obliged to go home, sacrifice my hand to save a life, or may I passively remain here even though another Jew is going to die? That was the question. And in the most fascinating and classic responsum, the Radbuzz, as you know, we have hundreds of his responsa, actually thousands, even though today there are many, unbelievably, that are not yet printed. We have many of them only in manuscript form. Of course, although we do have hundreds that are printed, is very prolific author of Shalas and Chuvas. And the Radbuzz has a lengthy responsum stretching over 2 responsa where he deals with this question. He gives about 10 reasons explaining why the man is in fact not obliged to go and sacrifice his hand. Right? Some of them are absolutely fascinating, not really relevant to today's discussion, but I'll just mention it for its novelty. One of the reasons that the Radbuzz brings as an explanation or a basis for the fact that the person does not have to sacrifice his hand is because of a principle in the Torah called Darkei Noam. Darkei Noam means that the Torah's ways have to be ways of pleasantness. Right? If you're taking a lulav, for example, of the 4 species on Sukkot, and you are choosing one that has thorns on, the Gemara brings a proof that that cannot be the one that's intended, because holding something thorny that will hurt your hands is not the way the mitzvah could conceivably be commanded, because it would transgress or go against the principle of Darkei Noam. It's not pleasant. The Radbuzz, amazingly, and you have to be a Radbuzz to quote a source like this, the Radbuzz says the reason you don't have to sacrifice your hand to save a life is because having your hand cut off would not be Darkei Noam. Okay, yes. I'm getting some questions on my screen. What about things like fasting that the Torah commands? And what about things like circumcision, perhaps? Okay, we're not talking about where it's explicit command. Okay, obviously. When we have an explicit command, that would be a different question. But here we are talking about a principle in mitzvahs, and to have your hand cut off to save a life is not. But he gives about 10 reasons. Now, one of the reasons is the one I want to pick out here. Again, it's worth working through the tshuva for its fascination and its novelty. But there's one reason that I'd like to single out here. And he says that if this cutting off of a hand would have an element to danger to the life of the person whose hand is going to be cut off, that's why it would be forbidden. That's what the Radbuzz says. In other words, if it's going to be dangerous, that would make it prohibited. You see clearly a source in the Radbuzz here, indicating that if it's dangerous, it would be forbidden. The Radbuzz goes on to say, debate the question of whether sacrifice of a hand is in fact a danger to a life, and he records the fact that he actually personally saw somebody die from an injury to an ear, bleed to death. No doubt the person had hemophilia, and this injury to his ear led to exsanguination, and the Radbuzz actually records that he saw such a case, bringing that as a proof to the fact that a specific injury like the cutting off a hand could indeed conceivably be a danger to life. By the way, many of our poskim rule today with respect to breaking Shabbos in order to save lives, that risk to a limb is usually considered a risk to life. Again, there may be exceptions, and this is a separate discussion. But when a limb is threatened, a limb or an organ, whether it be an eye or a hand or a foot or an arm or a leg, and we are considering breaking Shabbat in order to save not a life but to save a limb, okay, there are certain limitations involved in saving a limb. But where the limb, danger to limb, can be construed as a danger to life, certainly we would be doing that. At any rate, the cutting off of the hand, says the Radbuzz, if it would involve danger to life, would make it prohibited. He goes on to say, by the way, that if it would not be a danger to life, then in fact it would be allowed. And he rules that this would be what we call a midas chasidus, midat chasidut, which means a tremendous act of kindness and generosity, and it in fact would be allowed. I'm ignoring some questions if you don't mind, just because I won't get through the subject. So please hold your questions as I've requested before. I'll do my best to run through the questions at the end, and if I don't have time, please feel free to email me, and I will try to deal with the questions on a personal, individual basis. But I tried to cover all the bases that you're asking about as well. So here we have the Radbuzz telling us, and in another place, the Radbuzz, right, goes on to say, in the fifth section of the Radbuzz, in Rashi Ches, Rashi Ches 218, he has another tshuva on this. And in the course of the two tshuvas, the Radbuzz apparently contradicts himself, but if you understand correctly what he's saying, what he's telling us is this: that if you are risking your life in a significant fashion in order to save someone else, that is what he calls, that if you're risking your life in a way that is reasonable, a reasonable form of risk, not high risk to you, then in fact what you're doing is called a midat chasidut. Midas chasidut. It's a tremendously praiseworthy act of sacrifice of a limb, generosity, and in fact it is allowed, but not obliged. Not obliged, but allowed. And elsewhere the Radbuzz makes plain that if somebody risks his or her life to save someone else, he's called a chasid shoteh. Chasid shoteh, which means a pious fool. Namely, clearly that it's totally forbidden. How do we put together this discussion in the Radbuzz? This is very clear, and we find this analysis in all of our latest sources who deal with the Radbuzz. We can summarize as follows. And here's the bottom line. So please stay with me, because this is the most important key to our discussion. If the risk to the life of the rescuer is small, it's an obligation. It is an absolute obligation. If you can save somebody's life with minimal, negligible risk to yourself, it is a clear Torah obligation. Which obligation? Which is the most obvious and clearest obligation? I will give you 5 seconds to type me the source, please. I'm challenging you. Where does the Torah tell us that you're obliged to save a life in general? No. The mitzvah is, Lo yisamod al dam re'echa. Do not stand idly by when someone is dying. Do not stand by when someone is dying. Lo yisamod al dam re'echa. You have a proactive mitzvah. To go out and to save a life. And therefore, you are derelict in your duty if you could save someone and you do not. Says the Radbuzz, if the danger to the life of the rescuer is negligible or minimal, you have an absolute obligation. And for that reason, you would be obliged to give a blood transfusion. Whether you're obliged to give a blood transfusion to a blood bank when there's no specific individual who needs it, that I'm not going to go into now. There's Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva on that. But if there's someone who needs your blood, let's say you have an unusual blood type, there's someone who needs your blood right now, the risk to your life of giving a blood donation is absolutely negligible. In fact, for large parts of Jewish history, people did it as a therapy for themselves, as health-promoting activity. There's no question you're obliged to give blood. Bone marrow, with the type of a pheresis experience, or a blood pheresis, or bone marrow involving general anesthesia, that may be more of a discussion. But there's no question that minimal risk to your life you are absolutely required to undertake. You are not free to desist, and you are neglecting and derelict in your duty if you don't do that. Next degree, if the risk to your life is moderate, then it's discretionary. If the risk is moderate, you are allowed to, but not obliged to. And if the risk is great, says the Radbuzz, you are prohibited. Let's say that again. Minimal danger to life of the rescuer, you're obliged to do it. Moderate danger, significant danger. Again, moderate does not mean 50%. It means a lot less than that. But very significant danger. There, says the Radbuzz, no one can oblige you to do it. The Torah does not oblige you to risk your life, but it's discretionary. You are allowed, given dispensation, to risk yourself to save someone else's life. And it's incredibly praiseworthy if you do, but cannot be obliged. And finally, high risk would mean that you are prohibited because the Babylonian Talmud does not make it an obligation, and we do not codify the Yerushalmi, as I explained before. So that is the ruling that most of our poskim follow, and that is the definitive position in Jewish law. So let me summarize it once again for clarity. When you can save a life at minimal risk to yourself, you're obliged as a Jew. When you, and by the way, we don't make distinctions here between Jews and non-Jews. The Sons of Rov made that very clear, again, without going into that whole discussion. But these things are to be applied universally in modern society. So, minimal risk, obliged. Moderate, significant danger, but of course, less than the danger to the victim. It has to be clear. Your risk is significant, but less than the danger to the victim. Then you are permitted to do it, and that's called a midas chasidus. You're going beyond the letter of the law. And if the risk to yourself is high, that is called a chasid shreiter, a pious fool, and you are not allowed to put yourself at such risk. Just one side point made by the Shevet HaLevi, which is very beautiful for those students of halacha among you. He says that since when do we start making percentages? Minimal, right, a very small percentage, and then we're talking about a high percentage, less than 50%, more than 50%. He says there's a well-known principle that when it comes to saving life, we don't use percentages. We know that any risk to a life is considered highly significant. Right? I hope you can hear his challenge, the Shevet HaLevi. Why are we asking whether the risk here is small or large? Okay, why is it relevant? After all, the law is very clearly, we don't follow the majority when it comes to life saving. We know that we'll break Shabbos, all Shabbos, on the off chance of saving a life, of any quality. We'll desecrate Shabbos the whole day to save somebody who has an extremely small percentage chance of being saved, for almost any small amount of time, of almost any quality of life. We don't use percentages when it comes to saving life. Why here are we discussing whether there's a minority risk or a majority risk, and how great the risk is to the victim? Why suddenly are we using percentages and proportions? And he answers what should be a very, very clear answer to anyone who thinks about it, should see that this is clearly the answer. He says the time when we are not concerned about percentage risks is when there's only one person at risk. There's a person at risk, and on the other side is Chilul Shabbos. So here's a life at risk, and we are contemplating breaking Shabbos. It doesn't matter how small the risk is to the person who will break Shabbos. But in our case, we're talking about another person putting himself at risk. So we got the victim, and we consider we would like to override the statistical problem there because it's a risk to life. We would regard any risk to life as highly significant. The problem is that the rescuer will be at risk here, and we're trading off one for the other. Says the Shevet HaLevi in mathematical terms, the one cancels the other, and so we go back to using percentages. And I hope you appreciate that it's a very beautiful nuance in the subject. Now let's move on. The Chasam Sofer right, the Chasam Sofer quotes the Radbuzz, and he would like to learn that the bottom line in this whole discussion is that it is permissible, right, for one to put oneself at high risk. Again, this is not a majority opinion, but it's the great broad shoulders of the Chasam Sofer. So unlike the Radbuzz, or possibly learning the Radbuzz a little differently, the Chasam Sofer rules, right, this is in his Chidushim in Ksubis, on Daf Samach Aleph. If you'd like to look it up, that's page 61, in Ksubis. In his commentary to the Gemara, the Chasam Sofer says that one is indeed allowed to place oneself at very high risk, in order to save a victim who's at greater risk. That's what he says over there. Now the Or HaChaim goes even further, right? And this is extreme. The Or HaChaim, in his work, which is known as Rishon LeZion, right? It's a work in his commentary on Yoredea. The Or HaChaim actually says that you can sacrifice your life to save someone else. You can sacrifice your life to save someone else, right? That's an extreme opinion. We are not following that opinion, but he says that one is in fact allowed to give away one's life for someone else. And again, this is not normative in Jewish law, but he says, although it is used as a partial component of other heterim, there's a time we'll talk about that, but this is the famous Rishon LeZion, who says that one is allowed to actually sacrifice one's life to save someone else. There's a fascinating question on this, of course, and I hope you'll enjoy this. The question is from the Gemara in Bava Metzia. Right? I'm sure you know that the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Samach Beis, there the Gemara says that if two people are wandering in the desert, and only one of them has a bottle of water, right? This is a classic. Almost everyone knows this section in the Talmud. We got two people who are traveling in the desert. And in the hand of one of them is a flask of water. There's only enough water in this a bottle of water that if he drinks it himself, he will get back to civilization. Now, there's enough water to guarantee his return to civilization. Why do you want to do that these days beats me. But let's say you a child of modern civilization, and you value being part of it, and you want to get back home. If you drink the water, you'll get home. If you share it with your friend, then you'll both live another day, and then both die. In other words, there's not enough water for both to survive in the long term. There's only enough water that if you share it, you live a little longer, both, and then guaranteed to die. Or you deprive your friend of it, it's your water, you drink it, you survive, and he preemptively dies sooner. There's a fascinating debate in the Talmud. Ben Betura says, do not stand by and watch your friend die. You drink it and let him die sooner. Not the correct course of action. Share it with your friend, and you both die. Rabbi Akiva says, Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva, until Rabbi Akiva came along and taught, Chayecha koidmin. Your life comes first. And that is clearly the definitive way we rule in that Gemara. Your life comes first, and therefore you are required to drink the water. You're required to drink the water. You drink it, he dies sooner, you get back to civilization. That is what the Gemara is telling us. Right? I hope we're all clear on that. Well, think about it for a moment. This Gemara is telling you quite clearly that you may not give away your life to save someone else. The Gemara says, Chayecha koidmin. Your life comes first. We follow the ruling of Rabbi Akiva that the one who has the water drinks it. That is very clear. It couldn't be more clear in the Gemara. So the question is, how can the Rishon LeZion say that you are free to give away your life to save someone else? It's very altruistic, and it's very noble, and it's very chivalrous. But it goes against the Gemara. Right? I hope you all see that. The Gemara says very clearly, Rabbi Akiva teaches, and we follow his rule, okay, very clearly, that you are to drink the water yourself, and you are not free to give it to your friend, and that is very clearly the rule and the law. How will the Rishon LeZion or Or HaChaim deal with that? Well, the answer is, he learns that Gemara as teaching, not that you are obliged to drink the water, but that you may. Is the question in that Gemara Rabbi Akiva, is Rabbi Akiva teaching an obligation or a heter? Is he teaching you that since it's your water, you're obliged to drink it and save your life because Chayecha koidmin is an obligation? Or is the Torah simply telling you a heter? You may drink it and save your life. You don't have to regard the mitzvah of tzedakah, giving it away to someone else. Right? You may drink the water yourself. all our great authorities learn, virtually all of them. This Gemara is teaching you that it's your obligation to drink your water and save your life. Chayecha koidmin is an obligation. The Ohr HaChaim is telling you that it's a heter, and therefore he has no problem with that Gemara. Rabbi Akiva is only telling you what you may do, but in fact you're not obliged to. That is indeed how he learns that Gemara. Again, it's a lone voice, not definitive in Jewish law, but that is what he says. Does he have an earlier source? Yes, the Sefer Hasidim. The Sefer Hasidim, Taf Reish Tzadik Ches, that is 698. There, the Sefer Hasidim says that you are allowed to give. Now, the Sefer Hasidim is not a definitive halachic work. One needs to remember that. It's not a code of Jewish law. It is a broader work. But nevertheless, it is brought in halachic context in many cases. And the Sefer Hasidim says you may give away your life to save your teacher, or to save somebody who's a Talmid Chacham. But a student, a Talmid, a disciple can give away his life to save his Rebbe. He actually quotes somebody called Reb Reuven Astrobali, who gave his life to save Rabbi Akiva. The provenance, that story, we don't know what that story is referring to. I don't think the Talmud mentions such a story, as far as I know. But the Sefer Hasidim mentions such an individual who gave his life to save Rabbi Akiva. The Sefer Hasidim, no doubt, is learning the Gemara the same way as the Ohr HaChaim is going, and therefore he rules you may in fact give away your life to save somebody greater than you, and Ohr HaChaim generalizes that to a principle that says you can in fact give away your life to save someone else. That is his position, and again it's an outlying position. So in summary, the Chasam Sofer says you're obliged to endanger yourself to save somebody who's in greater danger. Again, let's start at the most extreme. Ohr HaChaim, you can give away your life to save someone else. Chasam Sofer, you're obliged to seriously risk your life for somebody who's in greater risk. But most poskim, the vast majority, and clearly the definitive position in Jewish law is minimal risk to your life, you're obliged to save someone else. Moderate risk to your life, you may if you wish. High risk to your life, you may not. That is our... By the way, how do you judge whether the risk is major or not? It's a moderate risk, but you're afraid. Is this significant enough that you should not risk your life? How do you make that judgment? Well, the percentages are not clear. The percentages are not clear. The Gemara does not talk about percentages. And here we need to do a little bit of mature construction for ourselves. I'll give you a couple of rules of thumb. One that you find in the Chasam Sofer, and the Chavetz Chaim makes this point as well. Ask yourself, and I think the Rav Issa Unterman made the same point as well. Ask yourself, how much risk would you take for something that's very important to you? Somebody is drowning. You want to jump in and save their life, but you're worried you might not survive. Would you jump into that sort of water situation to save all your worldly possessions? Now, some of us don't have too many worldly possessions to think about, but imagine you have worldly possessions that are very, very dear to you. There's a burning house. If you let the house burn down, you lose everything you have. If you run in, you can save something that is of major, major, major financial importance to you. Would you risk your life to save it? If you would, risk your life to save someone else's life. Here's the concept. That Jew's life should not be any less precious to you than something that is precious to you. Another Jew's life should be no less precious to you than all your material possessions. If you would jump into that ocean to risk your life to save your worldly possessions, that level of risk mandates that you jump into the same ocean to save another Jew's life. If, however, you would not jump into that ocean, right, because you genuinely consider the risk too great, you'd let everything you own go up in smoke or go down, submerge. In that case, you may be justified in not trying to save that individual. And our poskim are very clear: do not be too fussy too fastidious about your judgment. Okay. I just got a message from Dr. Walter Abelman. We'd like to send him our compliments and admiration. It's another doctor on the front lines, right, who's been ill himself. These are the sacrifices that our doctors are making, along with all the other Jews involved in the NHS in general, and doctors and health workers throughout the world. They deserve our very, very great admiration. We wish you well, and we are very grateful for the work that you do. So that is a summary of these laws. Another rule of thumb, if you like, Rav Asher Weiss says maybe 10%. Again, you can't hold him. He says people always ask me, exactly how much, exactly what percentage. He says, what am I supposed to say? 15.003 and 2 halakim. You cannot give a figure to this as a question of judgment, but that is some of the way to think about this problem, and I've given you the major sources that deal with this question. What are the practical applications? Doctors who are professional and employed in that role, they've taken on that profession, they're certainly obliged to expose themselves to these sorts of risks. Not that long ago, an Israeli surgeon refused to operate on a hepatitis positive patient, and he was disciplined. I think he had his license to practice medicine revoked in Israel. According to Jewish law, that is appropriate. You're talking about resuscitation of a highly infected patient. These are the sorts of questions that are coming up all the time, and a danger of 10%, something like that, would be a reasonable, certainly something that one is allowed to, perhaps the borderline between what we would call low risk and moderate risk or high risk. There's room for judgment in this area. Now, to save many is a different question. To save many, we've spoken so far about risking one's life to save one person. But when it comes to saving many, we have a different set of criteria. Here, the Gemara is clear that to save many, one is allowed to undertake far higher risk. I'm not saying obliged, but when talking about extreme risk. In fact, it is clear, according to the Babylonian Talmud, that to save a community, one may in fact sacrifice one's life. This is learned from the story of Papas and Lodianus, right? This is a Gemara in Tainis in Yud Ches, that's page 18, where Rashi explains the circumstances during the Roman occupation of Israel near the town of Lud. A Roman girl, I think she was in fact a nobility, a daughter of the governor, was found killed, and of course, as always, the Jews were blamed. And the governor of the area threatened to wipe out the entire Jewish community unless the victims stepped forward and admitted to what they'd done. Two holy Jewish brothers, Papas and Lodianus, stepped forward and falsely admitted that they were the murderers, and in fact they were put to death. According to at least one of the commentaries, he knew that they were lying. He knew that this was an act of self-sacrifice, but he'd made his offer. He was obliged to stick to it. They gave their lives. And the Talmud says that they guaranteed a place in the world to come that no one can compare, to which no one can compare. So this is a very clear source for people giving away their lives to save an entire community. That is different standard, and therefore to expose oneself to very serious risk, right? That one may do, not obliged to, but may do to save a community. So that is very clear. In terms about a COVID risk, epidemics, plagues and so forth, we follow the rule that it's certainly permitted to put oneself into that danger. If you're a professional in the line of duty in this type of an outbreak, it is indeed obliged. Again, I'm not talking about somebody, a healthcare worker with very high risk or a vulnerable immune status or heart disease or one of the other complicating factors. But under the normal circumstances, one is certainly obliged to expose oneself to this type of risk. Throughout Jewish history, this has been tested. There were plagues and cholera epidemics. Reb Chaim of Brisk personally required and personally attended to people during epidemics of cholera. And I'm sure I don't have to remind you that Reb Chaim of Brisk was extremely solicitous when it came to danger to life. You probably know that very famously he was lenient about people eating on Yom Kippur when they had some sort of illness, and people said, "Rabbi, why are you so lenient with Yom Kippur? You're normally stringent." He said, "I am being stringent. I'm lenient about Yom Kippur. I'm being stringent on saving of life." And nevertheless, despite the risk to life, he required people to attend to plague victims and epidemic victims, which he did himself. This was the ruling of many other rabbis and was done at the time. There's not only risk, but also other needs as well. During a cholera epidemic, there was, in the life of the Chazon Ish, again I can't tell you the exact details, when the Chevra Kedisha stopped burying people because of the risk of infection, the Chazon Ish went and picked up a dead body himself right, and attended to its needs in burying that person. When the Chevra saw that, they resumed their duties. So this is very clearly what has happened over time. Let me leave you, if I may. I don't want to keep you too late. Let me give you one more example that details community issues. By the way, the next component of this discussion is triage, really, when you expose yourself to danger to save other people. But what is the differential between the people that you're saving? How do you apportion scarce resources, right? And how do you weigh up these variables against each other? So, Mi'at Hashem, on Wednesday night at the same time, I will give a detailed talk on triage, meaning apportionment or rationing of ventilators and scarce resources. That's the other major question that we are facing at this time. And so I cannot go it. But just to introduce it and follow on from our discussion about risks to caregivers, in other words, risks to yourself to save others, let me leave you with just one thought, and if there's time, I'll pose you a halachic riddle, right, as some food for thought in this time of isolation. The Gemara in Nedarim, that is on Daf Pei, right, Amud Beis, that is 80, page 2. There the Gemara talks about two cities. Now, this is a fascinating case. Imagine two towns with one water source. So the water source is coming, let's say, welling up by one town, and they have the right to use the water, and then it continues downstream to the second town. Imagine that there's only enough water that if the upstream people drink, there'll be enough water for the downstream people to drink as well. But if the upstream people drink and wash laundry, there will be no water for the downstream people, and they'll die of thirst. Again, the Gemara goes to various scenarios. The Gemara says if it's our water for drinking and their water for drinking, we have the right to drink it, just like the bottle of water in the desert. If it's our animals against their animals, we have the right to save our animals. But what if it is a question of our drinking, our laundry, and their drinking? So in other words, there's enough water that if we use the water sparingly and drink, there'll be enough water for them to drink. We all live. But if we drink and do our laundry, there's no water left for them to drink, and they may die of thirst. What's our obligation? Are we constrained to drink only and leave them drinking water? Or may we do our laundry as well? Give me a quick answer, please. Type in drink only or laundry. I'll give you 5 seconds. Yes, I'm getting some very impassioned answers. Not only drink only, I've got one answer that says drink only with 4 exclamation marks as well. Well, let me tell you, this is an argument in the Gemara. There's a majority opinion, the rabbinic opinion, that they drink. But there is a lone voice of yesterday who says that in fact we do our laundry. We do our laundry. We drink and do our laundry. Now the Gemara makes plain that if we don't do our laundry, there'll be serious and extreme suffering. Some would like to say even a risk to life, not as immediate and not as acute as the risk of dying of thirst, but nevertheless a risk to us nonetheless. According to one interpretation, a distant risk to our lives. According to another, extreme discomfort and distress. Amazing. You see that a city, listen carefully to this, you see that a city may prioritize not only its drinking, but its cleanliness and hygiene and laundry over another city's needs to drink. Meaning, the other city will be forced to find another water source. It may be more difficult. They may have to go further afield. Okay, we're not saying condemning them to a certain and immediate death necessarily. But you see here, the main point I'd like to extract from it, again, many lessons in this Gemara. Many lessons. This has major political repercussions. Okay, what a government or a ruling body should be doing in terms of its citizens. Because this is a community issue. This is clearly not an individual issue. But what I'd like to bring out from this Gemara in Nedarim is just one thing, and that is that a community has different rules than individuals. Even though a community is a summation of individuals, it has different rules. Let me illustrate that very clearly, if I may. Here's the illustration. We are saying that when two groups of people have to make a choice, the one group can drink and wash, or drink only. They may drink and wash laundry. Is it for a moment conceivable that two individuals in the desert, imagine two people in the desert. You're walking along in the desert, you have a bottle of water, and your friend has none. If you share it with him, okay, you both survive. But if you share it, if you keep it yourself and drink and do your laundry, he dies. Is it conceivable for a moment that you'll be allowed to do your laundry? Unthinkable. Again, you're walking through the desert, you're both dying of thirst, your friend says, please give me some of the water, we both survive. You say, no, I want to wash my shirt. Right? Inconceivable. Which means you see clearly that this is a different standard. The Gemara has two separate sections. When it talks about in an individual, you drink the water. When it talks about a community, you can do your laundry as well. You see from this clearly that there's a difference here between a community obligation and an individual. Let me tell you that, let me leave you with a halachic dilemma, if I may. I know there are lots of questions. I don't want to keep you too late. What I will do is leave you with a fascinating question, if I may. I hope this keeps you up for many nights, thinking deeply halachically. And if there's time and you're willing to stay, I'll try to answer a few questions. Let me tell you this question. The Gemara says that when you're in the desert, right, with a bottle of water, the reason Rabbi Akiva says that you drink it yourself, is because the verse says, V'chei achicha imach, and your brother shall live with you. After all, you need a verse, you need a source text. The source text is, V'chei achicha imach, and your brother shall live with you. With you means subservient to you. With you. You primary and he's with you. Right? That's the clear meaning of the verse. Rabbi Akiva says, Chayecha koidmin, your life comes first, because the verse says, your brother shall live with you. With you doesn't mean takes precedence over you. With you means ancillary, together with. You're the main and he's accompanying you. And that's how Rabbi Akiva learns from the word imach that you come first. And here's the problem. The problem is that the Gemara in Kiddushin, Dav Chaf, there the Gemara quotes exactly the same word in exactly the opposite way. The Gemara says, if you own a servant, right, let's call it a slave, we're talking about a Jewish slave, an indentured worker. There says the Gemara that if you own a slave, if you require a slave, you've required a master. Fascinating Gemara. This is the Jewish notion of slavery, by the way, that when you take a slave, you've required a master. Why, says the Gemara? Because he'll take precedence over you. Why will he take precedence over you? Well, it says like this. Because if you have only one bed, that means a Jew is obliged to treat his slave like himself. The Gemara says if you eat rich bread, he must eat rich bread too. If you sleep in a soft bed, he's got to sleep in a soft bed. You've got to give him the same conditions as you yourself have. Right? Because it says that he shall be imach with you. B'tov lo imach. It shall be good for him with you. But with you means, in this case, superior to you. How does it mean superior to you? Says the Gemara. Imagine you have a decent bed, you've got to give him a decent bed. You've got a good loaf of bread, he must get one. What happens if you've only got one bed? There's only one bed. Says the Gemara, well, he has to be the same as you. But he can't be the same as you, there's only one bed. If you say, okay, so neither of us get the bed, that's called midas toim. Right? You want to make him equal to you, so you insist he sleeps on the floor and you sleep on the floor as well. That is totally immature, that's a midas toim. Well, you'll have no other option than to give him the bed. Because if you sleep in the bed and he sleeps on the floor, that's not called imach. He's not being the same as you. And since he has to be the same as you, meaning obviously at least the same as you, if there's only one bed, he'll get it. And in that circumstance, you see that the Torah puts him ahead of you. There's only one decent loaf of bread, or one decent slice of bread, right? He has to have the same as you, but there's only one. There's only enough for one. Well, if you give it to neither, and you let the bread rot, right, that is a midas toim. You'd have to give it to him. So you see that the word imach here means that he's superior to you. That's a dilemma. How come with a bottle of water in the desert, the fact that your fellow has to be the same as you means he comes second to you, and the very same word with a servant means he comes prior to you? Why don't we learn them the same way? The bottle of water is yours, and he's secondary, you drink it. The bed is yours, and he's secondary to you. Same word in the Torah. Right? That is your halachic dilemma. It's a fascinating dilemma, and great minds have given answers to this, and perhaps the next time we meet, I'll try to give you the answer to this. It's an absolutely fascinating answer, or number of answers. So I'll just say the question one more time to urge you to think about halachically. The Torah in two places uses the same word, imach, with you. With you, says Rabbi Akiva, when it comes to water in the desert, means second to you. You come first. But when imach, with you means there's only one bed, and your servant gets it or you get it, it means he gets it. So here's the halachic dilemma. How do we interpret the same word in the Torah in two opposite directions? Why is he second to you and does not get the water? And yet, when it comes to the bed or the bread or any other thing that a servant needs, a Jewish person working for you, and there's only one, it means he comes first and you come second. Okay, I'll take another couple of minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes, to answer the questions if you permit me. I'm seeing a lot of attempts to answer the question, but they're not correct as far as I can say. So let me challenge you. Okay, any questions practically, please, from any doctors who are listening to this question? That's a good question. Adrian is asking, why would we regard a community as different than an individual? Why do we regard a community as different? The Jewish community has a certain holiness that transcends the individual, and the needs of a community are different than the needs of an individual. Now, this is a subject that Asher Weiss went into in detail, and again, if anyone cares to contact me personally, I'm happy to send you a recording of his talk on the subject. Okay, so I don't see any practical questions remaining on the screen. Forgive me if I didn't answer a question that flew by me too fast. This is a summary of the law of Jewish people putting themselves out in epidemics and exposing themselves to danger. This has always been what has been done, attending to the sick, even at risk to one's life. If you are a professional, you're required to do this. A Jewish community has the right, or a human society has the right, to require people to be firemen and rescue divers and bomb disposal experts and infectious disease specialists. We have a right to do that. Not that you have to volunteer necessarily for that particular position, but it is a norm in the society, and as Rav Asher Weiss often points out, and this is perfectly acceptable and tremendous mitzvah. Let us finish with expressing our thanks to the NHS and the healthcare services across the world for what they're doing for Jews and non-Jews. Let us help them by taking this seriously. Okay, it's very, very clear that the mode of operation now is total isolation. Absolutely, at the moment, we don't know where this is going yet. We need to buy time. We need to isolate very, very clearly as the clinical information and epidemiological information comes in. In Yetz Hashem, the merit of our Torah study will merit us a speedy recovery with robust immunity, so we can go back to where we were before, but better. Thank you very much.